So I'm going to speed through some of this because I want to give you as much as possible. I want to show you the range on a global level, because a lot of times, I mean, the United States, women's history, they gave us Susan B. Anthony and, you know, different figures that are famous women, not working class women. And in England, you have something of the same thing. But what about the entire planet? You know, and especially the much overlooked indigenous societies. So I call this restoring women to cultural memory, because history is memory practiced together. And so, okay, sorry, and just wave at me if I'm fading out. Okay. Well, I probably will be. Okay. So you know, history is not just what men wrote down, but we have the indigenous orators, and a lot of time these have stories about female founders who are sometimes referred to as first woman, and we have stories of migrations. Women as the farmers, the builders, all of this. And so this process of recovery, and I've been doing this since 1970, and I'm pursuing the visual record because that's a broader expanse of humanity than what we can get from what's written. But these are histories that have been devalued. They tried to sweep it from the boards, and you know, some people would say, well, it's not a male conspiracy, and it's like, that's not the point. Whether they were threatened or whether they weren't interested or they thought it wasn't important, then that's not, you know, they did this. The gatekeepers kept this from us. And this is knowledge we desperately need, because the intention of patriarchy is to demoralize and separate and divide women. So, you know, this is a long-term record we're trying to recover. And so we as feminists know this, indigenous people know that, working class people often knew this in the past, although we have a situation now where the hegemonic power is so great that they are deprived of the original knowledge, that, you know, the oral tradition was severed, and now we have advertising and TV and movies and all that. So women's history and the ancient female figurines are an example of that, is entire worlds, and the gatekeepers have kept it from us. They showed us the kings and the generals and the male scientists and philosophers and all of the great men, and they kept out the women, even when some of those women, as we'll see a little further on, were the originators themselves. So I want to begin with the rock art, because this is the testimony in Central North Africa of rock art is amazing. We're starting to see figures like this one, which may date as far back as 8,000, 6,000 BCE in southeastern Algeria, in the Tassili Najer. We've got, is it a woman? Is it an ancestor? Is it a goddess? This is one of our perplexes over how do we interpret this. But you'll see the dotted patterns around her. There are these numinous fields of energy. They're also painted on her body, and we're going to see this coming up in a couple other examples. She's running, and you can't make it out anymore, but between her legs is a rainbow goddess. So the rains, many people have looked at those dots as rainfall coming from a cloud. And these Saharan murals are great art. They should be in all the world histories of art, and they aren't. You see in them very often evidence of women's activities, ceremonial dances. This could very well be a womanhood initiation, round dance, which occurs all over the world. But we actually see women as ceremonial leaders in some of these rock paintings. And this one's a very important one. I don't have a site name for this yet, and this is typical of this research, is you get a fragment, and maybe 20 years later you get another fragment to contextualize it a little bit more. But I'm going to zoom in. You see a ceremony going on here which probably has to do with hunting magic. A man is kneeling in front of a woman presenting his bow, and then you have other figures, but I'm going to zoom in on the two women, and they're separated, as you saw, holding ritual staves. We have an elder woman in the right whose hair has been dyed with red ochre, symbolically the blood of Mother Earth or of woman. And this woman seems to be blowing either on a ritual staff or perhaps on an arrow relating to the hunter. So at the left, we see a very, very ancient, in the Egyptian Western Desert, Karkul Tal site, and you see a woman in gold jewelry. It looks like she's hefting a spear. This other one is quite a bit later, but it's still quite old, maybe 2500 BCE or later. And there's this elegant woman. Can you see the similarity to Egyptian art in this rock art? The Saharan art predates the dynastic Egyptian art that we all know. And so she's got the multiple necklaces, just like you see in the Old Kingdom onward. And she has waist beads, which are an African motif that's still very much present, particularly in West and Central Africa. There are also petroglyphs, and here we have very wide-hipped women wearing headdresses. Are they feathers? It could be various forms of basketry that they're wearing on their heads. There's whole realms here, whether these be deities, ancestors, or representations of living women. Now what's very interesting here, and this is Gilf al-Kebir, is where Egypt, Libya, and Sudan come together. It's a little corner of Egypt, and it's a huge rock formation, and it's full of paintings. So I'm really fascinated by this one because you see the big crack going across, and you see women with their arms raised in invocation. This is definitely a ceremonial or dance scene. And what the artist has done below the crack is show their reflections as if they're standing by the river. The other image, though, of the same gesture comes from pre-dynastic Egypt. And so there's this iconographic unity across northeastern Africa that is really important to study because a central symbol before the pharaohs of the ancient Kemetic civilization is the ceremonial woman in a boat. And whether this is a goddess or a priestess, it's hard to say, but this gesture of the hands in that form is something that still exists in some of the cattle herding societies in East Africa, for example, in Uganda. But you can see the natural world very much present in these pots. And the bottom is a rollout, and so you see ibexes and ostriches, and you can also see the ceremonial boat is equipped with branches. So, you know, it's adorned with elements of the tree of life, essentially. And we see them also in petroglyphs in Nubia at Komombo. So there's a whole vast connection from the ancient rock art and going forward into paintings in pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt. And we can see the same kinds of motifs showing up in Arabia. So West Arabia has a lot of these invoking women. They're much later in date, or at least according to the archaeologists, they're about 7th century BCE. They go from West Arabia all the way up into Jordan. But this is, I'm showing you some of these images are from entire visual talks that I have that look at the regional history of various parts of the world. And so ancient Arabia is much overlooked. You know, people tend to emphasize Mesopotamia. Again, the obsession with civilization and dynasties and social hierarchies and wealth accumulation, all of which act against, ultimately, women's power and women's social leadership. So that I grew up in North America, and you know, the ancient native archaeology is, we weren't taught any of it. Maybe it's changed a bit, I don't know. But these red flint clay figurines have been identified as having to do with, in this case, the green corn ceremonies that are still practiced by the Cherokee and other peoples. The Cahokia culture, this was the largest pyramid in North America. It's actually an earthen pyramid, and it was surrounded by many other mounds. But this figure is of a woman with a hoe, and she's hoeing what appears to be the ground. But if you turn it around, it's a serpent. She's hoeing the back of a serpent. So there's whole mythologies and cosmologies here. And part of this, you see Corn Mother, so the figure at the right, she has the ear of corn, which is still used ceremonially by the Kiowa, the Hopi, a whole swath of peoples, the Iroquois nations. And the other woman is holding the corn ears up in her hands. So this is a very important sacrament that is still a living tradition, but these figures are about 900 years old. They also made pipes in the form of the sacred woman. And so the back of the figure at the right is the pipe bowl. And some of them are in birthing postures, and some of them are holding a sacred medicine bundles in their hands. What's really interesting is that not only do these women pipes occur in the southeast of what's now the US, like the Cherokee example, but the ones on the right are from the Amazon basin along the Tapajos River. and they have the same motif going on. So there are a lot of Pan-American connections as people migrate or cultural themes are spread. Can you all hear me well enough? Yes. Good. But then if we move down the eastern coast of Mexico, there are all these amazing cultures that hardly get touched on in the histories we're given. So the Tenic, or the Huastec people as they're usually called, you've got hundreds of stone statues of women that can range from 4 feet to 7 feet tall, wearing headdresses, and the two at the right here, their heads are actually emerging from the jaws of animals. They're animal masks. They have their hands over their bellies, which in a lot of world culture is a sign of the life giver. You know, this is the womb, this is the source of entire peoples. Also in this region, the Totonac people have a symbology of, the Aztec word for this is Cihuateteo, which means woman spirits. And they deified women who died in childbirth. They died giving life. And so they would pray to them, and they made all these statues. These are ceramics that are about 4 feet tall. And when you die, unless you tie up the jaw, it'll drop open, but they look like they're chanting, you know. Really, really fascinating stuff. If we move inland into the plateau at Teotihuacan are these fabulous murals. And many of these appear to be female divinities. She's holding up the growing flowers, and you've got these ceremonial headdresses. You've got mountains with the phases of the moon in front of her. And this one is just one of the great masterpieces of world art. How many of you have seen it? At Tetitla in Teotihuacan. She's wearing a half jaguar mask, that's the tusks. She has the green bird headdress, maybe a quetzal bird, and then she has also the serpentine imagery, but her hands, water is pouring forth. She's the life giver, and from this water are shells and all kinds of other things that are symbolic in this culture. But when we could go to murals also in India, the Ajanta cave paintings, which some of you may have seen, masterpieces that show us how women looked in India in the 5th, 6th century BCE and later. And so you see women dancing, and this is in a Buddhist context, but there's a lot of continuity between these paintings and the clay figurines that were being produced in northern India in the river valleys. So we can do this for each region, a whole series of videos on Crete, which I'm going to be putting online pretty soon. And so you see priestesses, you see goddesses, you have the ceremonial headbands, seals with sacramental dance, actually ecstatic trance, and sometimes that little round one toward the right, shape-shifting, the dancer grows wings. Sometimes her head changes to a bird head. And we can do this also with the Etruscans, and they're very strong. In their time, they were regarded as a ridiculously egalitarian, sex-egalitarian culture. The ancient Aegean, the Neolithic cultures, there's just so much to uncover. And if we go chronologically, we can see the progression from a very female-centered to a more patriarchal societies over millennia. Now, some of the most disregarded histories are those in Africa. And so this is another presentation I have on Southeastern African societies. Again, the rock art with the ceremonial women, you know, spirit diviners or whatever they may be. And then we also have female ancestors. You've got the antelope-headed woman there with the divine life essence proceeding from between her legs. Next to her is a female healer with all her regalia from Zimbabwe. And then a female chieftain from Zambia. There are living matrilineal cultures in Zambia, like the Luvale people, who have female chiefs. They're female clan heads. And figurines, lots of different things to explore. We can look at this also in Iran, another place, although it's kind of like a little more on the historical screen, mostly because of the Persian Empire. There's this vast Neolithic history that has a strongly female-centered symbology. And very close to nature, the ibex goddess with horns is very important in that. And I have a little bit of that video on Max Dashu channel on YouTube. You can see, there's about 70 videos there where you can see all or parts of these different presentations, visual talks. If we move inland into Central Asia, there's the Bactria Margiana culture, and they have numerous majestic stone-seated figures of women in these kind of feathered cloaks. If we go back even further in time, there are the Neolithic cultures, and there again, as we see all over, well, most of the planet anyway, the ancient female figurines. In my early research, I saw those as goddesses, but more and more I'm seeing them contextually as ancestral women from matricultural societies. Here in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, you have the female statue menhirs is how you'll often see them described by archaeologists, but I call them the grandmother stones. Because, the ancestral woman, in some of these societies, they have both male and female figures, but in some parts like northern France, northwestern Italy, southeastern Italy, they're all or mostly female. And so this is something we have not been shown at all. You have to go into specialized archaeological studies to find them, and the discussion of them is really not focused on that female content. Another disregarded region is Spain and the Iberian culture, which is coeval with the Romans, the beginning of the Romans. Incredible sculptures, and again, very strong female iconography. So priestesses, ancestors, goddesses, the goddess Tanit comes through with the Punic influence from the Phoenicians. Women holding offering vessels, and just tremendous things. In central Nigeria, there are the Nok sculptures. These are ceramic sculptures. When I first discovered these, all I could see was images of men. And I had to consider the possibility that that was all there was. This is all provisional, this research. I can't just make it up and say, well, yeah, they had women too, until I know that. But it took years, decades actually, to uncover the fact that there's a whole load of women in this art. And the gesture of the life giver, hands to the breasts, you see the same dotted patterns on the breasts of the woman at the left that we saw from Tassili N'Ajjer. That's a very long historical through line. So then later on at Ile-Ife in Nigeria, ancestral Yoruba culture, we have royal heads of both women and men, but these are typical queen's crowns from that culture, women's tattoos in some cases. And so these cultures existed. It's the gatekeepers who deprived us of knowing about them. And here we see both racism and sexism implicated, classism too, in the withholdings that have gone on and what they said was important. So if we go over to South America, there was a whole body of matrilineal cultures with female chieftains in the Chibchan-speaking region of northern Colombia. And I'll come back to them. Well, here it is. They had golden breastplates, like a lot of beaten gold breastplates, representing the ancestral woman. And sometimes they have snakes or other animals. You can see the birthing ancestral woman there on the upper right. And so the Senu culture, the Tairona culture, the Quimbaya culture, you have golden figurines of women, naked women, proudly naked, and these are not like our media images of women who are simpering and coy and pouting for the male gaze. They are full-bodied, looking straight out you, fully empowered women. And so this breast motif is something that recurs. We see it in the Dogon culture, which was patriarchalized, and yet they retained that symbolism. But here we're in Timor, in eastern Indonesia. And so these breasted doors belong to a culture that has remained matrilineal up to our time. You see spirals below the breasts. There's this womb of regeneration going on. There's a lot of cosmological commentary going on in the art. Here's another view. The motif of necklace with breasts on ancestral women figures, in this case doors, is something that occurs in the megalithic European civilization as well as the Ethiopian, which I don't have in here apparently. But then also in Germany, in the south, along the shores of Lake Constance, the Bodensee, they found a building. At first I thought it was maybe a clan lodge, but it was a communal lodge with the ancestral grandmothers of all the people in the community. And there's our white dots, the numinous field of life force, again, within the bodies of the mothers, whose breasts are again molded. They were fallen, the plaster cracked after 5,000 plus years and fell on the ground, but they reconstructed it. And you can see at the top the trees of life in between the ancestral women. So this leads to the topic again of matriarchy, and I've been seeing more and more Indigenous testimony using the term mother law, which I really like. Okay, thanks. Okay, yeah, so we're going to look at some of the mother law traditions, and the Minangkabau lady the other day was talking about these traditions, the matrilines. The word that they used before the Dutch word matriarchat was adat ibu, the tradition or the law of mothers. And you can see from these women the majesty they have. They are self-contained. They are not dependent on males. They are the ones who own the house and the lands. They're the center. The brothers belong to that kindred, but the women are the ones who hold the space. And so the central pillar of their longhouse, the Rumah Gadang, is named for Bundu Kanduang, which I've seen both translated as own mother or first mother, or first woman. Oops, going backwards. And so the longhouses, Minangkabau means victorious buffalo. And there's a whole story about an attempted conquest in which they were able to hang on to their adat ibu, the mother line tradition, while also converting to Islam in order to prevent being conquered and wiped out, basically. So the water buffalo horns are the symbol worn in the house and also the ceremonial headdresses of the women. So last year, I heard Haudenosaunee women, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, also use this term of mother law in talking about their traditions. So rather than using European term matriarchy, they're also saying mother law. And we have a lot of evidence because this is a living tradition. It was oral, but it got written down in the colonial period as the great law of peace. You have the tree of life there, the white roots of peace subduing the weapons. Longhouses presided over the Gantowisas, who are the ancestral women, or really not ancestral, but the female elders. They're referred to by colonial sources as the matrons of the Iroquois. And this law says, the lineal descent of the people of the 5 nations shall run in the female line. Women shall be considered progenitors. They shall own the land and the soil. Men and women shall follow the status of their mothers. So this is their law to this day. So we had this perplex as we tried to recover this history. There was a huge pushback against the naming of matriarchy. And so, Bachofen, back in the 19th century, came up with Mutterrecht, mother law, which also means mother right. And we could think of that as rights from the mother, but also rights of the mother. Of course, matriarchy. And there's a whole discourse about that Peggy Sanday and Heidegger Abendroth pointed out that the word arche, before it meant rulership, meant origin, beginning. So that's an important intervention. Matriculture was something that Canadian Indigenous women came up with. Rian Eisler, Guy Lanny, the combination of the male and female in partnership. And then we have also gynocentric or woman-centered, matristic, and I came up with matrix society because there's this idea that centrality is not only that descent is from the woman, but that the organizing social principle is of the life support matrix. Okay, and we'll have a little bit more about that. So matrix originally in Latin means womb, source, and origin. And it's related to the word for mother, and also the word matter comes from that root. And then, of course, in modern philosophy and mathematics, a matrix is a place where something is situated, where it grows, where it exists in relationship with others. And so I find that a very meaningful thing. So what are these societies? We cannot absolutely describe them. They're not all exactly the same. But recurring elements are descent in the female line, living centered around the woman and her kin. We have mostly patriarchal marriage in history. In modern history, a woman goes to live with a man. They were sex egalitarian, and this is very different when anthropologists say, well, the foraging cultures are egalitarian. They don't really talk about the sex part of it. They often have communal houses. The lands are collectively held. There's not private property. It's collective. And the key Male-female relationship is not husband-wife, which is a legal tie, but sister-brother, which is a blood tie. And so the Moswo and the Minangkabau and the Hopi and in many other matricultural societies today, this is still the organizing principle. Then there's social motherhood, and this is important because the nuclear family isolates women. But if you have extended kin living together and you have shared responsibility across generations, but also like all the sisters' children are considered to be related. They're all sisters and brothers, and so the aunties are regarded as social mothers, and so are the uncles who have various titles. So that, you know, that whole generation is taking care of the youngers and also the elders or the disabled. And then you have female divinities, not exclusively, but very strong thing around female ancestors, spirits, or goddesses. Relaxed about gender, no absolutes. Women can do men things. And gender variance exists, but not in an authoritarian way. No stigma on sexuality because there's no bastardy, there's no illegitimacy in a matriline. The children of the mother are automatically belong to that kindred. They're never homeless. Where we have the situation of a man leaving the woman with a bunch of children, she falls into poverty, she doesn't have protection anymore. In this social system, there are no homeless women and children. They have the kindred. And then finally, gift economy. Prestige comes from giving and sharing and not from accumulating and selfishness. So, you know, counter-capitalistic ethic. So I'm going to give you a few more other examples. I'm going into more detail here because I think it's important. But I'm rushing because I want to show you all of this. So in Kerala, the word for matriarchy is marumakatayam. And a sister's children. So again, this whole generation of women and their children, all a kindred. And this is used in various cultures. The Mapila, which is one of these ethnic groups there, actually means mother-child. And that's a terminology that it turns up elsewhere. But names for clans in these mother right cultures, we have in Melanesia, Susu, the milk bond, and Itabap Pisili, those who suckled together. This is the kindred. If you shared milk of the various sisters, then that makes you kin. And actually adoption rituals involved a woman taking even an adult person to her breast, symbolically, you know, she may not have milk anymore, to adopt them in. And even the ancient Greeks, who were patriarchal, still had this concept of homogalactes, drinking the same milk. And so there's a lot of these names, and another group is the kindred are called of one womb. And so we see this in Minangkabau, we see it with the Ashanti, the Shore in Siberia, and even in Hebrew there's a lot of matrifocal remnants that scholars have tracked. B'nai Batni, the children of my womb. B'nai Umia, also among the North African Amazigan, the so-called Berbers. And among the Khasi in far northeastern, what's now India, Ki Yaube Tindre, the ancestral woman is called mother of the root. And so these are matrilineal and matrilocal societies. In what they have termed the Bantu matrilineal belt in central South Africa, the Bapende and many other peoples are matrilineal, sometimes patrilocal. So this is what I'm referring to as the shift away from a matriarchal pattern because women are marrying out now, and that's very significant. But they still put the ancestral mother on the clan crest at the top of the house, the central communal house. So the mother law, it's a whole framework, it's a whole cultural web of meanings, and we really see the centrality of those who bear, who nurture life, who feed, who protect, who house. They're the culture keepers, the knowers, and the teachers. And these are the old women, the grandmothers, and they are the final authority. But not authority because of some artificial structure, but simply because of the work they have done, their contribution to the entire community. That's the basis of authority. It's not an artificial hierarchical relation. And so we see, for example, in North America, I didn't know this when I began my research, but a large number of the societies were, and some still are, matrilineal. you know, in various different regions of North America, in the southeast and the northeast, the southwest, the northwest coast. You all find examples. The Wichita and others we'll look at. So I spoke before about the bond between the mother's children, and maternal aunts will be addressed as mothers. This is very widespread. Even in some patrilineal societies, this is something that persists. But it's the sister-brother bond. So the brother may go off over the hills to visit his lover, and they don't have any sexual stigma. Most will honor the sexual bond as one of the most sacred things, but there's no controls over it. But he comes back at dawn to work in the fields with his sisters. So, you know, this is matrilocality as well as the matrilineal bond. And then in the little atoll of Tokelau in the South Pacific, the female elder is called Fatu Pai Pai, which means stone foundation of the house. That's her title, and she is the head and the final word in the Kaiga, which is the extended kindred. And so again, not hierarchy, but because of her experience and her wisdom. And so consensus decisions, she's not the one who just calls the shots all by herself, but there is counsel. This element of counsel is really important. And so we see women's councils. And we also, the tamafafine, which means actually the children female, literally, they are in charge. This is the middle generation of women. They distribute the food. So not only the taro that they grow or the breadfruit that they process, but also when the men go out fishing and bring back the fish, it's the women who distribute it. And we see this in the North American hunting cultures as well. The women control the food supply. Here's a Wayuu Women's Council, and again, we're back in Northeast Colombia. And this is a living tradition which, do I have another slide of this? No. Some of these pictures show the women with cell phones in their hands. Very, very up to date. And so women's councils, and they can exist side by men's councils, and then there is a meeting point. But again, this is forms of female authority. We all had to fight our way into male-dominated structures, whether it was academia or business or all the rest of it. Here's one from the Muskogee culture. Out of the southeast, they got marched on the Trail of Tears out to Oklahoma, where this is taking place. But, you know, there's this veil cast over the authority of women in these cultures. And so the Gantawisas had their own councils, and these are the elder women. They had veto power over the men's desire to go to war. Men could, in their council, not discuss issues until the idea had been forwarded over to them by the Women's Council. Structural authority, public authority, and leadership by women. And so I mentioned before, they're longhouse people, so you'd have many families inside, all descendants of one ancestral mother in these longhouses. And this is a pattern that exists in many parts of the world. So in Southeast Asia, you have many matrilineal and sometimes matrilocal societies living in longhouses. Vietnam highlands, the Jarai, the Mnong, the Ede, the Thai peoples. And look symbolically again, there's the breast and necklace. This time on the ladders going up onto these houses, which are raised because this is rainforest territory, keep from flooding. But you have also the longhouses of the matrilines of the Haida and the Tsimshian and various other peoples along the western coast of Canada and Alaska. And we can reconstruct Neolithic longhouses here on the island of Jersey, but also quite a few of them in Central Europe, the Russian culture in Germany and various other neighboring countries. Or else you would have roundhouses. And this is another group in the northern plains along the upper Missouri River, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and Arikara, matrilineal, matrilocal cultures. And these are women farming cultures. They had very elaborate gardens that they kept, and they were praying to Old Woman Who Never Dies, who sends her messengers in the form of geese, swans, and ducks to let them know, now is the time to plant corn, now plant the beans, now plant the squash. And here's an example from Nigeria, and I don't know what culture this is, but I'm giving you close-ups here where you can see that over the doorway, itself a symbolic vulva, you see the figure of the mother with her arms protectively extended over the children. So this maternal emphasis is very strong in Africa. There's a lot of, if not outright matrilineal, basically remnants of it that exist. And even some of the empires, like the Empire of Ghana in West Africa, was originally matrilineal. In Maluku, and here we're going back again to the far east of Indonesia, you have the luli altars representing the ancestral grandmothers. There again, the breasts and necklace. And offerings are placed in these altars. Here's an entire box for food offerings or whatever to be placed. And we actually have the name of Huxraina Huxtualina, who was the founding mother of Luhuleli village. So behind what we're looking at in this artifact here is an entire orature that I don't have access to. I don't know if they keep it alive to this day, probably do. But then the partnership cultures, which may not be fully matrilineal anymore, the Etruscans were bilateral. They had both the mother and father lines in their names. This is part of the reason the Romans and the Greeks were like, what's wrong with these people? They're egalitarian, you know. But this concept of partnership culture that Rian Eisler named is something we can see in a lot of these societies. So here we are back again in Colombia. And it's very important to look here, along with saying, you know, mutuality and parity and all these kinds of respectful patterns, that when you look at the male and female figures, they're dressed differently, but they're basically kind of the same. There's not this extensive gendered differentiation. They're on the same plane. And in some of the cultures, Yunnan in southwest China, which is now part of the Chinese Empire, originally independent ethnicities, it's very common in this whole area for women to initiate courtship. It's for the women to ask the men to dance. And here in the case of the Lisu women, they're serenading the men. You know, so again, patterns that we're used to going just one way, we see other ways of doing, and especially female initiative is something, you know, female choice, right? Female self-determination is really important. So other remnants in the Basque country, the Etxeko Andere was the house mistress. The word mistress doesn't do it for me, but you know, lady, the words we have in English don't really give the authority behind this position of the female clan head in the Basque extended families. And there's a lot of Basque writings about the communal nature of Basque culture, the matricultural essence of it, in contrast, as one writer put it, to the Aryan, because these are non-Indo-European peoples. They're the last remnants in Western Europe of the ancient kindreds. Okay, so I wanted to talk about mother right yet because there's a lot, it's very important, but another area that doesn't have to do really with descent systems, but it does have to do with women as providers and life support matrix upholders is what I call mother tech. And we've got the women who farm, who build, who gather the food, who preserve it, who store it. And so there's this integration in balanced cultures of technology and spiritual culture, right? And you'll see this in a lot of Native American cultures as one example. So here are the Wichita women. They build the houses, and look at the size of that house. They have these lodges. And house building by women is common all over the world. Sometimes in nomadic cultures, it takes the form of tents of some form or another. So you've got the teepee or the wigwam and the mobility here. And the women are not only make the houses, they tan the hides, they make the shoes, the furnitures, the packs in which food is kept. They are the manufacturers of the society. And so that pattern also exists in northern Asia. So you have various Siberian women using exactly the same kind of technologies. And then, well, the weaving tents among the Bedouin and also South Asians like the Tibetans, yak hair tents, goat hair for the Arab women. And they owned these tents. In ancient times, divorce was initiated. If a woman wanted it, she simply put the man's belongings outside the door and he knew it was over. East Africa, too, we see women builders, and among the Maasai, the women not only build the houses, but they also build the ceremonial enclosures for men's ceremonies. You know, now these are patriarchal cultures, but you see what I call female spheres of power, or women's technologies that still exist. So the Pueblo women in both New Mexico and Arizona are builders. or they were the builders historically. So here's 125 years ago, we see Hopi women, about 11 of them, building houses at Oraibi, which is one of the oldest cities in North America. And so here come the Spanish colonials, and they try to get the men to build the churches. And everybody stands around laughing because, who ever heard of men building? Now, I have to add, the men provided the wooden beams. So very often there's an overlap in the work in that way. And look, in Burkina Faso, the women also sculpted the houses and painted murals, and all over Africa, Nubia all the way to West Africa, all the way down to South Africa and up to Uganda, women painting house murals. This is something we also find in Western Arabia. And these are the beautiful murals of Asir. And so there's just so many different things which we're talking about. Technology, we're talking about artistic creation, we're talking about symbolism, which has meaningful stories and cosmologies attached to it. And so this is expressed very often on pottery painting. And so the Pueblo women are really famous for this, all the symbols that they inscribe. I call this a scripture of signs. And the artistry is just tremendous. It's very traditional in a great many human societies for women to make this kind of, not just art, because it's an expression of meaning as well. And so you say in various parts of New Mexico and Arizona, you have the symbol on the lower pot is like in Peru they call it the Tawachacana. It's the image of the directions. You see lightning bolts. There's a lot of quadrants for the directions. And moving down to South America, all over the Americas, you see the step pattern combined with the spiral. There's something that goes from Argentina all the way up into Colorado. Okay. So a scripture of signs where the symbols have cosmological meaning, often related to creation stories or the time-space matrix, which is what that quadrant has to do with. Vulva signs very often, spirals, but also the images of women doing ceremony. So you've got the women's dance, or the women standing in the quadrant, and their hair streaming behind them. A great many of the Neolithic traditions, women are painting spirals in earth pigments on the pots. So here's examples from Thailand and Neolithic China, the Yangshao culture, the Majayao culture, the Shipibo potters. This is still a living tradition in the Amazonian side of Peru. These are also matrilineal and matrilocal cultures. And then, of course, also weaving. The same thing, the symbols, but also weaving itself is an act of creation. It's tied in with birth and death, funerary ceremonies, all kinds of different things. The weaving is very central. And you may realize that when we talk about texts, this word comes from textile. These are forms of writing or symbol encoding by women. That's a whole wrap in itself. And so we have murals again from the Pueblo country showing women doing the basket dance, which is still being done in honor of the corn, and holding up ceremonial prayer feathers, the pajos. But women are providing food. They're farming the corn, squash, and beans. And then the biotechnologies they use to cook it, to preserve it, to make tortillas or tamales or corn soups or acorn soups, and then how they preserve the food. And this is all chemistry. Salting, drying, smoking, fermentation, all of this is mother tick. Because the mothers are at the center. It's not that nobody else can do this, but they are the ones who have the responsibility of providing and feeding. And so you continue in patriarchal societies to see women working in the fields. And you may have heard the statistic that women even now provide the bulk of the world's food in many societies. And so there they are out in 110-degree midday sun, out in the rice paddies, doing the back-breaking work, although they have very strong backs, of replanting the rice. And this is in China, this is in Southeast Asia, this is in the Philippines, and this is also in West Africa, where the rice growing technologies were brought under slavery into the Carolinas and other parts of the colonial Anglo world. Millet farming in West Africa, very early, much overlooked. And then you have also the Bantu farmers moving down into areas that had foraging cultures. They were mostly hunters, the San and the Twa peoples. So I'm not going to talk in great length about patriarchy, but we've got to touch on it, obviously, because what happened? How did this take place? And I don't have room here to describe the whole process. But systems of male dominance. We have testimony to this, again, in the orature. So in Mali, the Duga epic tells us, descendants from the woman has ended. But descendants from the woman is better than sterility, and sterility is better than an evil child. Well said. And so these are I have some of the patriarchy overviews, very much overviews, are on my video channel, again, Max Dashu channel, where we look at systems of male dominance, capture marriage, and many other things, beatings of women, female punishments. But we can look at some of the origins of patriarchy in capture, raids in which women are taken as captives, kill the men, rape the women. This is the pattern of conquest. It's still going on, right? And also using the capture of women as pretext for war. But the colonizing of female bodies for sexual access and control by men, for procreative power, and thereby inheritance of lines and property in a hierarchical society, and also unpaid labor, and ultimately for emotional service in a servile relation to men. But this patriarchal, the sexual double standard comes from the attempt to enforce paternity. You can't know. There's an African American proverb, mama's baby, papa's maybe. Matrilineage is stable, and patriarchy requires legal systems and customary systems of control. So we've got all the various forms of patriarchal law throughout history. They have to know who the father is for that social system to be viable. So there's the Romans. And here we are in Azerbaijan, and so the boy preference and the punishment of women who bear girls when it's actually the male sperm who determines, is it a boy or is it a girl? Ignorance and patriarchy. Child marriage, coercion, arranged marriage as an economic relationship, accumulation of property or status as a factor, forced marriage, compulsion of women, this is again Azeri, and battery and abuse within marriage, marriage by capture, which is still going on here in the Maya culture, but we also see it in the Kazakh world of Central Asia, some Ethiopian cultures, coercion, the Hmong have it symbolically, and servile marriage. So this is an ultimate form of patriarchy where this woman is the vassal. She is subordinate in very definite ways to the husband. And, you know, the English marriage ceremony that you always see in Jane Austen movies, you know, she has to pledge to obey. We have formal gestures of submission, touching her head, the most sovereign part of her body, to her husband's feet. And so this is called dokdine in Nepal. This is done also in India. So child marriage, again, is a form of servile marriage because there is the difference of power status, not only by sex, but by age. And then you have, you know, the prostration of women made to kneel before their husbands as they present food to them. But patriarchal religion goes beyond law because what it does is it internally colonizes women's minds. And it forces them to, I mean, women control themselves from inside because it's inculcated from such an early age. And God wants this. You have to obey God, and if you disobey, you're defying God. As Mary Daly said, if God is man, then man is God, right? And so those codes, and we see it in the Sharia courts of Iran in very explicit form. Nothing without her husband's consent. Divorce is the male prerogative. Women have to apply to an all-male board of qadis to get the right to divorce. It's not at all a sure thing. He simply has to say the talaq 3 times. And when women divorce of their own initiative, they lose their children. Custody goes to the men past a certain age. It varies according to various schools of Sharia. And so there's this punitive attitude, and the Catholic Church is no better. They also encode child marriage. In Europe, 12 was the Romans, and then later on the Catholic Church, very early marriage, and all-male priesthood with intensely patriarchal law codes. We also see the sale in patriarchal societies, the sale of daughters, boy preference leading to girls being sold very often into brothels or as slave concubines into wealthy families. They are not counted as part of the kin. There's a Chinese saying, they're like spilled water. Why give wealth to another family? It's not worth it to educate her or give her anything. This is an entire presentation. I'm just touching on this, taming the female body, whether it's by whipping her through the streets, cutting off parts of her body, or constraining them with corsets. Bound feet, not only in China, but as you can see above that, the tiny, tiny, tight shoes that were worn in France and colonial Peru. And the witch's bridle will come to. This is a whole presentation which is free on YouTube. Silencing women's speech. It's a vast subject. It's very much something that we have undergone, especially in the last 25 years, in the backlash. And the witch's bridle is part of that. We see there Maria Cano in Colombia being held at gunpoint with a gag. This was also in the suffragist, anti-suffragist cartoons, various types of punitive, cutting off women's tongues and things like that in the symbolism. So in Sumerian law, and this is the beginning of the dynastic period and very hierarchical society in Sumeria, if a woman speaks disrespectfully to a man, that woman's mouth is crushed with a fired brick, and it is displayed at the city gate. Women of former times married 2 men, but women of today have been made to give up that crime. So here we have an inscription in cuneiform showing the process of patriarchalization advancing over time. And so women's speech in Rome, they were to be quiet in the presence of men. They were casting their gaze down. This was the rule, and the Greek world was very much the same. In the Confucian doctrine, we have Sode and the 4 virtues, including women's constrained speech, their deference in various different forms. And brides were trained in this behavior so that they could properly be obedient to their husbands. But as Mary Beard says, when it comes to silencing women, Western culture has had thousands of years of practice. And here's an example from the witch trials, which were a major enforcement. Even after the Greeks and Romans, this process continues. The witch hunts is a massive colonization of women at a new level. And so the witch judge, Nicolas Rémy, I believe that for whoever wants to tie the devil's arms, it will be necessary to take women out of the world. And so he did. He burned them at the stake. Now, the witch hunts are a legacy we're still living with today. And that includes the silencing. But the disapproval and the isolation and the shunning and hounding of women, you would see women being blamed for the animal deaths or storms of hail that destroyed the crops, for anything. They made great scapegoats in a patriarchal culture. But here the core accusation, I want you to really pay attention to this, because we know this. The woman was able, by the power of her evil thoughts or spells, to magically cause harm to others, especially men, and even kill them from a remote distance. Whose suicides are being caused by the thought crime of women? Who, this accusation is alive today, and we saw it in the symbolic and the speech acts of burned turfs, images of women being burned at the stake, die in a fire. All of this was invoked, and then it was kind of pulled back because it was not a good look. But it's made a comeback. So we're dealing with this. And the thing is, the witch is regarded as the female evildoer, the harm to the community, who anything can be done. She has no rights as a member of the community. She can be performatively excluded in the name of inclusion. Okay, so Aldegonde de Rue is accused of being a witch, and she says, but hey, they say every woman is a witch, right? Women protested. Women's speech was a big part of where the persecution started. Or it could be just a look of defiance. And so another punishment, because it wasn't just the stake, It was drowning, exile, fines, being imprisoned, or being driven through the streets to be humiliated with the witch's bridle. And so we see this in both England and Germany, but I want to especially mark something that was known in Scots as scoring abune the breath, that you would cut a woman above the breath, you would cut her face and draw blood, and this was believed to remove her power to harm. So it involved drawing her blood. And so I have a lot more evidence than I can discuss in this short piece, but this is also something that was going on in England as well, the drawing of women's blood. And this is part of the social policing of women. You don't want this to happen, and so you look down and you don't say anything, you know. And so chup raho, be quiet, in a Pakistani TV series, this is still very much a thing in India and the South Asia in general. But I want to mark, because this is something I found, whereas, you know, patriarchy has taken over the planet, but there are these persistence in different forms in different societies of female spheres of power, and especially in the spiritual realm. I mean, we do have the exclusion of women from the highest orders of Buddhism, the Catholic priesthood, all of that stuff. But in many parts of the world, here in South Africa, the Isangoma are predominantly female, and they are the premier female, or the premier spiritual authorities, the healers, the diviners, and the seers. This is also true in the shamans of various cultures in Northern Asia. And so we see some examples here from Central Siberia and Eastern Siberia. But, you know, this is a whole thing. In Asian societies, we hear a lot about the patriarchy, but in China, Korea, Japan, and still today in Southeast Asia, female spiritual mediums is what they sometimes refer to them, but they're spirit priestesses. And they do ceremony. People come to them to fix family problems and illnesses and all kinds of life dilemmas. So that it has become a female sphere of power. The Wu in historic period, and you see women doing ceremony in the temples, and they are dancing, they're playing gongs and stone chimes suspended from the ceiling. There's a lot of imagery around that. We also have legendary figures like Chen Jinggu in Fujian, South China, and she was said to have founded a sisterhood of Wu at the sacred mountain, Mount Yu, and was a healer. And she was a marriage resistor. She took a lover, she became pregnant, and then it came that she had to do battle with her sister dragon spirit. And so she ended her pregnancy in order to do that. Nevertheless, and here's patriarchy in action again, she becomes deified almost as her opposite, the goddess of pregnancy and childbirth. And so she becomes the Lady of Ling Shui. We also have the 5 Shaolin masters. It's not always mentioned, but one of them was a woman, Ngui. And so she fled to Yunnan, and she originates white crane Kung Fu. And she teaches it to a young woman, Ying Wing Chung, because she was being pursued by a man who was either going to rape her or force her to marry her, same deal. And so she learns the martial art, and she defends herself. And she becomes really credited as the founder. Then there are the priestesses and the authors. The first known named author in the world is the priestess, Akkadian woman, Enheduanna. And her famous piece, Ninme Sara, is the exaltation of Inanna. It's a goddess song. And so this is her and her name in cuneiform. But we have female scribes in the Babylonian world, in the culture of Mari, up the Euphrates into Syria. And we have businesswomen doing trade. Some of them had seals and were probably literate. We have temple scribes in Egypt, and they are a minority. They're mostly male. There's a male power structure. But we do see female scribes. Here's an Aztec woman from the 16th century shown painting. The Aztec and the Mesoamerican writing was often in picture form. And then at the time of the Spanish conquest, Maria Bartola de Iztapalapa was regarded as the first historian of Mexico. And she wrote an account of the Spanish conquest, which they burned, but we know that she did it. We see in South India female scribes as well. And this is Savi Nirmadi, who was a scholar. She's holding up a palm leaf book in Karnataka. In North Africa, The Amazigh people, the so-called Berbers, the women passed the Tifinagh alphabet from generation to generation. And this is also something you'll see in the petroglyphs. So native North African script. In China, there was Nushu, the secret women's script that was used by women in patrilocal families. They would be married out, and they had their Laotong sworn sisters, that they were their best friends. They would keep in touch by sending fans to each other or other pieces of paper inscribed with the messages written in Nushu. And then we have one of the great poets of Vietnam. I don't know how to pronounce this. Ho Chuan Hong, I'm not sure. But called the Queen of Nom poetry. This is Vietnamese verse written in Chinese character. She had undergone 3 marriages, and it looks like several of them were as a concubine. In other words, a secondary wife, but not, she says, like the maid, but without the pay. But look at this poem. Sisters, do you know how it is? On one hand, the bawling baby, on the other, your husband sliding onto your stomach. Guess what he's about to do? His little son still howling at your side. Do you know how this is? So she's protesting patriarchy in her poems. Azerbaijan, Masati Ganjavi, who was a free-thinking Sufi writer, and she fought against religious orthodoxy. And so very important figure to know about. We also have Maryam al-Astrolabiyya al-Ijliya in Syria, and her father, for many women, the pathway to literacy, education, professions such as medicine, was through the father. The father had the power. He could say, okay, I'm going to teach my daughter. The mother didn't necessarily have that say. So many times it is through the father that women attain this access. But as we know, there are huge barriers. I mean, women had to fight their way back into the universities. And female scientists very often had credit stolen from them. Each of these women on the screen had that done to them by men who took credit. Rosalind Franklin being one of the more famous examples, but Lisa Meitner, the horrible stories. Jocelyn Bell, her supervisor, she discovered these, astronomical things, and he took the credit for it, and many times the men took the Nobel Prize as well for that. So this has been called the Matilda effect, after Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was what we could regard as the first feminist historian of women in the late 1900s. And so then we have also female chiefs and founders, and this is the Kwakwaka'waka, or the so-called Kwakiutl, a chieftainess. We can see there are spiritual attributes, the horned and feathered crown. In Peru, among the Quechua, Mama Huaco is the founding Coya, the priestess queen of the so-called Inca culture. And in the Nilgiri hills of South India, there are chants among the Toda of a female creator, Tokizi, who arranged the social order and put her hand to the various works at the beginning. And so she's the one who names the clans and the buffaloes and the sacred places and sets up the ceremonies. And we have female chieftains in Fencenu. The Spanish conquerors were astonished to see that women were ruling in some parts of this world. And there's this pattern of colonial officials being astounded that women are acting as rulers and diplomats, or maybe rulers is not quite the right word. But here we have Aliquippa meeting with Lieutenant George Washington. This is before the American Revolution. She had full authority, blew his mind. And the same thing was happening to the Chinese when they looked at Yunnan and various other parts of Central Asia, or here, in this case, in Vietnam. Nurengo, the country of the women, and the women are drumming. So we are not shown these patterns. They don't fit the patriarchal narrative. And they don't fit the Eurocentric narrative either. But we do see women rising from very oppressed positions as concubines. The 20th wife of the Mughal emperor becomes, because of his carousing and drunkenness, the unnamed ruler of the empire, and coins were actually struck in her name. And the same thing happened with Empress Wu, who was, again, a low-grade concubine and ended up ruling in her own right. First as regent for her son, but then her son died, and she was supposed to fade out of the woodwork, She refused to give up the reins of power, and she ruled longer, and actually she instituted reforms in taxation that benefited the peasantry. And then also under conditions of slavery, we have the whole traffic across the Atlantic, and women of the African diaspora brought along their priestess traditions. And so in Candomblé in Brazil, you see the authority of the Maya de Santo, and in the Caribbean, in Cuba and Puerto Rico, we have what they call Santeria. It's a fusion of Catholicism as a cover, as a disguise, while they continue the Los Siete Potencias, the seven powers of the old African deities. We have priestesses in patriarchal Greece, and there was a lineage of the oracles of Delphi, the Pythias, that went on for at least 1,500 years, according to aspects of Greek lore. And I write about that. I want you to check this out. I have one examination copy, which is already spoken for, but you can look, if you don't have dirty hands, you can look at the book, and I have flyers about that. The female diviners, the Kabatum in Syria, and the Bible itself in Exodus talks about Miriam the prophetess, who went out with her drum, and all the women followed after with drumming and dancing. But she's called the prophetess. And centuries later, in a later biblical book, we have a warning that the daughters of the people should not prophesy out of their own imagination. So they're making it up, and you shouldn't do it. In Rome, a very strong legend about the prophetic power of the Sibyl of Cumae. And we see also female diviners in the Mixtec culture of Mexico. And Aztec diviners, you see her taking questions at the top, casting lots, and speaking to the man. He's crying. He has a trouble to resolve. And so there's a lot of these female diviners. The Moche women are priestesses. They are prophets. This is probably a Huachumera. She's got something like peyote buttons that was called Huachuma in her hand, and you see her gesturing as if she's prophesying in an ecstatic state. Less known but equally important to the Delphic oracle are the oracular women of Malawi and Zimbabwe. And so these oracular priestesses, some of them within the context of matrilineal societies, such as the Chewa. And so the title was Makewana, which means mother of children, not because she is physically a mother, but that she is regarded as the one who is in authority over all the people. She's the rain shrine prophetess of the pool of Malawi, after which the country was actually named. That's how important this was in the Chewa culture. And we see elements of this also in Zimbabwe. There was a tradition of Ondoro, which means lion oracles. And you see this woman in the rock art confronting a lioness. And a lot of the rock art, we see a woman dancing with a staff, and I don't know if those are supposed to be swallows or bees, but something is going on. There's this mass of energy that she's facing there, the other world energies. So we have the healers all throughout Southern African cultures, ritually painted up in some cases. We have in the medicine women in North America, very important, much overlooked. This is in the Menominee culture of northern Michigan, and the Mashkikwe, the medicine woman. In California, the predominant pattern, especially in Northern California, was that the Indian doctors, as they came to be called, were female. And one of the most outstanding was a woman named Piwoya with the Anglo name Essie Parrish. And her title was Yomta, which means a song. She was one of the bearers of the Boli Maro Dreamer tradition that came out of the ghost dance that spread all the way out from Nevada to California and the other direction all the way out to the plains. And very important figure. Then among the Mapuche people in Chile, the female shamans, overwhelmingly female, are called Machi, and they play the kultrun drum like the Siberian shamans do to enter ecstatic states of knowing, healing, weather making. This is a whole show, and I'm going to try to have this open access online. We're fundraising to license these presentations so they will be free and available to anybody that's got a device. Rebel Shamans, Women Confront Empire. I did a DVD called Women's Power in Global Perspective, and I noticed in making that there was this recurring pattern of women who were spiritual leaders who led insurrections and resistance to empire over and over again. And so I started a new slideshow. It was only maybe about 36 or 50 slides. And now it's too many to show in one sitting. It's a massive pattern. And so we have Lozen of the Apache, and we have Dihya al-Kahina in Tunisia, Algeria, and I can't really name them all because I'm going to run out of time, but that is forthcoming. And I have it up on my stream on demand. One of them was Tang Sai-er, who led a peasant revolt against the Ming Dynasty in 1430. Toipurina, who was young, much like Joan of Arc was young, Kij woman who led a revolt in what's now Los Angeles in the San Gabriel mission. Slavery was the order there. And they were betrayed, so the revolt never got off the ground. Lozen, oh, here I do have her here. Medicine woman, warrior, and woman loving. She's shown here with Geronimo, who she joined forces with. She had the power gained at her womanhood initiation ceremony. She put up her hands and she could feel the energy. And she could tell what direction the enemy were coming from, how far away they were, how many they were. She kept a lot of the Apache alive. La Santa de Cabora, Teresa Urrea, in northwestern Mexico, a native rights activist, but also a healer and seer. And she's shown here healing people. She gained this huge native following, and the dictator of Mexico booted her out of the country as the most dangerous girl in Mexico. And I'm not going to go into details here because I won't have time. But again, the lion oracles. So the first Chimurenga in Zimbabwe fighting the Rhodesian English colonials was Nehanda Nyakasikana. And Nehanda is the title of the lion oracles. Fought Cecil Rhodes, who was bringing in the first machine guns and dynamite to conquer. She was winning at first, but once they brought auxiliaries in from South Africa, mercenaries, she said, okay, look, the Shona are going to be wiped out. I have to surrender. So they hanged her for sedition. Wananghucha, who was a Zigua woman among many, you see the map there, they were shipped out to Somalia and points north all the way into, as far away as Gujarat actually. But she led an exodus going south, and their original objective was to get back to Tanzania, to their homelands. But she realized it was too dangerous to cross Kenya. They would be re-enslaved, and so they settled along the Juba River. Women warriors of all stripes, and we've got, I won't give the examples, I'm running out of time. But Yenenga, warrior princess in Burkina Faso, the Trung sisters, who were deified also, fighting Chinese dominion in Vietnam. And around the same time, Boudica was fighting the Roman Empire here in Britain, out of Norwich. Oops, let me go back, I skipped one. Kaya women warriors, the ledger art of the reservation period shows a lot of this. And then, just this whole topic of dangerous women fight back. And so they're fighting back Aboriginal women in Australia against colonization, same with Molly Molasses in the Mi'kmaq country of Maine. We've got also the lesbian revolutionary figure of Louise Michel of the Paris Commune. We have Prudencia Ayala, who I'll show you in a moment, Siti Bint al-Saad in Zanzibar, who a speaker out against injustice of all kinds, and Chu Jin, the Chinese feminist revolutionary. Native women warriors fighting colonization in Oregon. Rogue River Mary, she was again very young, all night long rode her horse across the hills, and the Takelma were able to defeat the invaders at the Battle of Hungry Hill. Nwanyerua set off the Iwo women's revolt. You know about this? In the 1920s, 29. She started it by angrily confronting the tax agents sent by the English Empire, that they wanted to tax the native populations. They did this in Kenya, all kinds of different places. They wanted coin, and in order to get coin, you had to work for the colonials. But she refused, and there were revolts in different parts of Africa. It happened in Senegal too. And so the Igbo women adorned themselves in traditional regalia, and they marched through the streets. They cut down telegraph wires, which were the communication of the colonial state, and they refused to pay taxes. Very important revolt. Here in borderlands of Iran and Afghanistan, this is from the Hamsa of Nizami. A bold old woman grabs the reins of a tyrannical sultan and begins enumerating his atrocities to his face. And she got away with it, right? So the bravery of old women, we see it in the witch hunts, women who died under torture rather than parrot the pornographic lies that the witch judges wanted them to say. Another whole show here, Female Rebels and Mavericks. This is loaded with Digna Ochoa, I'll mention. There's a lot of Mexican women who have faced death threats, same with Anna Politkovskaya, in order to fight for justice against femicide and genocide. Another whole show, Women Speak, Women Write. I can't remember if I have this online or not yet. It will be eventually. And so in Europe, there was a whole thing in the period of the witch hunts. The Quaker women and the early Baptist women were fighting to speak in public, to preach. Even the heretics earlier than that were doing that. Under slavery, we have in the US in the early 1800s, Maria Stuart, who was preaching both women's liberation and black liberation simultaneously. And the male ministers of her church did not like that. She was eventually forced to move cities because they loaded so much opprobrium onto her. And Kurat al-Ain, who was Fatemeh Barghani, was similarly persecuted. She was one of the members, founding members of the Baha'i movement, but at one point at a conference of the Babis, as they were then known, she throws off her veil in a moment of passion and is preaching to the assembly of men. She is strangled with her own veil and dumped into a well. Hamideh Khanum Javanshir, Azerbaijan again, and she founded a satirical political magazine. She funded it actually, but she had huge influence on the massive feminist content in that publication. And I found out about her from Feminist Dissent, which is being put out here from the UK by a group of women who had some really worthwhile articles in there in opposition to oppression and fundamentalism. Kishida Tochiko, speaking in public in Japan, unknown, unheard of, fighting for women's rights. And she was a fiery orator. Huge crowds would gather to listen to her. And she was arrested and jailed for her speech, Daughters in Boxes, which protested the systematic confinement and obedience enjoined on daughters. But this is an interesting title too. The government is the force over men, and men is the force over women. And that remains today. Then you may have heard of the Edinburgh Seven. These are the first British women to get a degree in medicine. They had to fight, and there were huge harassments, attacks, physical attacks, taunting, doors locked, sheep set loose into their classrooms, a male riot when they finally sat for their medical exam at Surgeons Hall. They eventually had to go elsewhere to get their final stuff. And this woman, I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but Frances Power Cobb was a lesbian who wrote Wife Torture in England. And she talks about femicide in it. But she was also the author of a passionate love poem, I Love You, Mary. I talked before about Prudencia Ayala, and she founded this paper, Feminine Redemption. She was from El Salvador, of indigenous descent and also African descent, labor activist, founded this journal in 1913, and in 1930 she ran for president, although women did not yet have the vote. And then in Texas, Jovita Idar ran a press. Her family had a printing press, and so she was a publisher. She fought for women's rights and for Mexican rights in Texas, which was a very Anglo-dominated racist state, and founded the Feminine League Mexicanista. The Texas Rangers came to smash her press up, and she managed to beat them off. I mean, she scared them off. She stood in the doorway, and they didn't dare come in. I discovered a really interesting nexus of anarchist feminists. This is in Argentina, Virginia Bolten. She was a factory worker, a working class woman, and she founded a anarcho-feminist newspaper, La Voz de la Mujer, and the motto was, neither God nor husband nor party. And she was working in labor movements and tenant strikes and all kinds of things. Over in Bolivia, there was an anarcho-feminist unionist movement of women cooks. And so this is a picture of them in the 30s. And then if we go over into Michigan, Voltairine de Cleyre was a speaker. She published lots and lots of journals. She was very well known in anarchist circles, and Emma Goldman included. All the leading anarchists knew who she was, but her focus was really on patriarchy. And she calls out, you know, when people say, why don't the women leave? Will you tell me where they will go and what they shall do? And she continues, and that is rape, where a man forces himself sexually on a woman, whether he's licensed by the marriage law to do it or not. And that is the vilest of all tyranny, where a man compels the woman he says he loves to endure the agony of bearing children she does not want, and for whom, as is the rule, they cannot properly provide. So these female freethinkers and anarchists, Spain also had a lot of them. And Lucia Sanchez Saurnil, there at the left, was lovers with the woman at the right, America Barroso, and they founded the anarchist feminist Mujeres Libres. And this was part of the Spanish, anti-fascist front. And here again, like Voltairine, she targets male patriarchal attitudes and the lordship mentality that men have. And you know, here are the men, she says, who are critical of capitalist masters, and they have the same dominatory attitude in their own household. He who just minutes earlier had to swallow the bitter pill of bourgeois humiliation looms like a tyrant and makes these unhappy creatures, you know, believe that, or act as if they're inferior. In the Chinese Revolution, Ding Ling was in her own right a political actor, and Mao Zedong respected her for a time at least. She was able to articulate feminist views, but eventually that was overthrown. She was sent into a re-education camp, eventually rehabilitated. But you see the punishing, where in the early years of the various communist revolutions, they needed the women, and there was a rhetoric of women's liberation, but then it's tamped down and crushed in various ways by the all-male cadre, leading cadres. Here from Scotland, we got to have this, Bessie Watson, who was the first female piper. This was not traditional for women to play the pipes. She learned, and she paraded in suffragist colors with votes for women, and she has the Boudica necklace there. And so we had to put her in there. Whole slideshow on lesbian heritages. We've got Japan here, Greta Garbo, women from Jalisco, women from Mughal, India, Thai women at the bottom there, I love that, caressing each other's breasts. And just lots there. But I do have to call out Chava Zlocherer, who reinvented herself as Eve Adams, emigrating to the United States from Poland. She worked for a while in Emma Goldman's anarchist newspaper, Mother Earth, but she began to run a lesbian tea room in New York City, which was known as the place where ladies prefer each other. And she published the first book with lesbian in the title in the United States, Lesbian Love, and it was a private edition of 150 volumes of the women in her circles. Hawa Ibrahim grew up poor in North Nigeria, put herself through law school, and became a defender of women's rights. And so she's shown here, some of you will remember Amina Lawal, who was raped by a neighbor and sentenced to be stoned to death, only her, not him, and because she became pregnant. And so her life was saved, but Hawa has also defended many other women. Speaking of the witch hunts again, in many indigenous parts of the world you have witch hunts going on, and so in Assam, northeast India, the Adivasi activist shown here, Birubala Rabha, fighting against witch hunting meant fighting for myself and all women, at great risk to stand up against this. This woman, incredibly courageous, Papua New Guinea, Monica Paulus, fights the witch hunts in which all male groups torture women stripped naked with iron and fire until they're dead. And this is still going on. but she's fighting it. Then in the indigenous Peruvian basin, we have Tuira Cayapo, that's the name of her people, defending, she's a water protector, defending the Xingu River against petroleum companies and dam projects, various power company projects. So very gently touching the machete to the cheek of the Petrobras official. And here she is giving them what for. These are FUNAI officials who are in charge of Native affairs. And she also co-organized the first March of Indigenous Women in Brazil. Okay, good. We're on time. And then we could not go without mentioning Rebecca Lolosoli. Do you know about Umoja, the women's village? It's a refuge for women who are battered and abused. And it became a very successful economic cooperative. We want the right to choose our husband, own the land, go to school. We don't want to be cut anymore. We're talking about female genital excision. We want to make decisions and be leaders in politics. We want to be equal. And so the women of Umoja village, they're indigenous women, are making a new way to live as Samburu women in the world, in this village. In Bolivia also, the native women are turning out to protest femicide, which is very, very high throughout Latin America. The woman on the right has a sign, how many women have to die in order to stop the violence? We have the First Nations women in Canada and United States rising up, first in the Idle No More movement, and then in many other movements against femicide, the movement against murder and missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is very much tied both to sex trafficking and the man camps that are related to logging and the oil industry and various other oppressive violations of native sovereignty. Here are women in Bordeaux. As long as we are raped and exploited and treated as subjugable objects, we will fight. The women of Rojava deserve a special shout out because they have a revolutionary movement that centers feminist concerns around women's self-determination and women in charge of stopping male violence, empowered as police to intervene against those individual men. A free woman rises like the sun, one of their mottos. I'll just shout out here to Shirin Abu Akleh, who was shot down, a journalist, one of dozens, I don't even know, it might be scores and scores of journalists who have been shot down in unprecedented numbers for journalists in a war zone, more than World War II and World War I and the Vietnam War all combined. Julieta Paredes, an Aymara feminist, the movement that she's part of, Feminismo Comunitario, is an indigenous-defined communitarian feminism. They have it in Bolivia and also Guatemalan women. The Maya Xinca woman is leading that. Here we have another female chief in the Wet'suwet'en Nation up in what's now called British Columbia, but these are native Diné lands. Since time immemorial, my people have lived in a balanced relationship with our lands, and they are responsible for protecting those lands. They never lost legal sovereignty. There's no treaty and no ceding of land, and so they're fighting the pipelines once again. Now it's gas industry. So the native women are rematriating, and they are emphasizing again the authority of women. And this is happening along the northwest coast, and it's also happening in California. Among the Winnemem-Winto, we have a chief who is also the spiritual leader of this people, and defending the rivers, the salmon, the ceremonies, and the land rights. She restored the Balas Cholas womanhood ceremonies that had fallen into abeyance under colonial missionary influences, and here they are at their dance on their lands. So we're rematriating everything for all of humanity. This is a process that we all have to decolonize and remove all these interlocking systems of oppression in order to liberate women and to liberate the land and protect the biosphere and to liberate everyone. So that's my website. Look for it on Facebook. There's a whole archive there that we're in the process of reconfiguring onto the Suppress Histories website. There's going to be about 12,000 photo essays when we finish this process. Okay, so that's going to be a free resource, and that's the Suppress History archive.